The encountered evening air was cool and restless as Sundar Pichai stepped out of the small cafe on Market Street. He had just finished a tense meeting with a group of young founders pitching a startup, and his mind was full of numbers and deadlines. He glanced at his phone. Another meeting in 30 minutes across town. His driver was waiting by the curb. He tucked his hands into his coat pockets and started walking toward the car when he saw her. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, sat on the cold sidewalk near the cafe's door. Her back was pressed against the wall, her knees drawn up, and a thin blanket covered her shoulders. In her lap, a small boy, no more than 4, slept, his little face pale and quiet. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't holding a sign. She just stared at the ground and murmured softly to anyone who passed, "Please. Some food. Please." At first, Sundar didn't stop. His feet kept moving, the way everyone else's did. He had learned long ago to keep his eyes ahead in moments like this. But just as he passed her, the boy stirred and let out a faint whimper, clutching at his mother's sweater. Sundar froze, his chest tightened. For a moment, it was like he was back in Chennai, standing on the dusty street outside his childhood. Home, watching his own mother hand the last piece of roti to him and his brother, while she pretended she wasn't hungry. He remembered her thin hands and the sadness in her eyes. He turned back. The woman looked up at him then. Her eyes caught his, dark and full of something that words could name. Pain, fear, dignity. She didn't speak this time. She just waited without thinking too much. Sundar went into the cafe again and bought 2 sandwiches, a bottle of water, and hot tea. He crouched down next to her and held the bag out. "Here," he said softly. "For you and the boy." But to his surprise, she shook her head. "I don't want your money," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "Please, just help me find my son." Sundar blinked, confused. He glanced at the sleeping boy. "But isn't this him?" She shook her head again, and a tear slid down her cheek. "This is my nephew, my son. They took him." The words hit him like a punch. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. All around them, the city kept moving. Cars honking, people talking, phones ringing, as if nothing had happened. The woman clutched his sleeve, now her eyes desperate. "Please, you look like someone who can help. Please, find him." And Sundar just stared at her, the bag of food still in his hands, and felt the ground shift under his feet at this point. The part would continue to about 3,800 words, developing the scene into more tension and flashbacks, showing his inner conflict, and ending with the cliffhanger of her saying, "Find my son." Asterisk the search. Air outside was heavier now, as if the city itself could feel the weight of what had just happened. Sundar stood frozen for a few moments, staring down at the woman on the sidewalk. She was holding his sleeve tightly, her fingers cold and trembling, her eyes still glistening with tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. In her lap, the little boy, her nephew, she had said, slept soundly, unaware of the storm swirling around them inside Sundar's chest. A quiet battle began. Part of him screamed to walk away, to let it go, to get back to his car and his meetings in his carefully ordered world. That part of him reminded him that he was the CEO of one of the largest companies in the world, not a detective, not a hero. But another part of him, deeper and older, spoke softly but firmly. It was the voice of the boy he once was, the boy who had walked barefoot through the streets of Chennai, the boy who had watched his own parents sacrifice everything for him, the boy who had known hunger and shame and fear. That voice said, "Stay dot," so he stayed. "What do you mean they took him?" Sundar finally managed to say, his own voice strange in his ears. The woman loosened her grip just slightly and looked away, ashamed. "Some men," she whispered. I don't know who they were. They came to where we sleep under the bridge. They told me if I didn't pay them, they'd..." Her voice broke then, and she swallowed hard before she could finish. Sundar knelt down beside her. Ignoring the chill of the concrete, when did this happen? She glanced up at him now, as if measuring whether she could trust him. This morning, she said, just after dawn, I thought if I begged enough, I could get the money and find them before they... She bit her lip hard and fell silent. Sundar felt his stomach twist. His mind, trained to solve problems and calculate risks, was already spinning. Do you know where they took him? Where they might be? She hesitated. Then she reached into the folds of her blanket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. On it was scribbled an address in shaky handwriting. She handed it to him without a word. Sundar unfolded the paper slowly, reading the numbers and street name. It wasn't far. A part of town he didn't know, a place tourists avoided and locals whispered about. Come with me, he said at last. We'll find him. The woman stared at him in disbelief, as if she couldn't quite believe what he had just said. Then she nodded once, sharply, and stood. Minutes later, Sundar was sitting in the back of his black sedan, the woman and the boy beside him. The driver glanced nervously at the rearview mirror when Sundar told him that Vespa didn't argue. The car rolled forward, and the city lights outside grew dimmer and harsher as they left the safe polished streets behind Dot as they drove. Sundar studied the woman out of the corner of his eye. Her clothes were thin and torn in places, her hair pulled back loosely, her shoes scuffed and wet. Yet there was something in the way she held herself, a kind of quiet strength that reminded him of his own mother. She kept one hand on the boy's chest as he slept, and the other clenched tightly in her lap. What's your name? Sundar asked gently. She didn't look at him when she answered. Neera, and your son's name? Her eyes flickered. Then, as she whispered, Arjun, the name hung in the air between them, fragile and full of meaning. Sundar repeated it silently to himself. Arjun. The car stopped at the edge of an alley that seemed to swallow the light. Sundar stepped out first. The smell hit him immediately. Stale beer, trash, something faintly metallic. He turned back to help Myra out, and together they stood at the mouth of the alley, the boy still sleeping on her shoulder. She pointed to a narrow doorway halfway down. That's where they go, she murmured. Sundar nodded slowly. He took a breath and started walking. Each step echoed against the walls, and he felt the weight of 100 eyes watching from the shadows. This was a place where people went to disappear, a place where no one cared who you were, only how much you had in your pockets. When they reached the doorway, they found it slightly ajar. Sundar pushed it open with the edge of his shoe. Inside, the air was even colder, and the dim light revealed cracked tiles and peeling paint. Wait here, he told Mira softly. But she shook her head and followed him anyway. The hallway was long and empty. Their footsteps seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Sundar could feel his heartbeat in his ears. Halfway down, something caught his eye. A small, worn-out backpack leaning against the wall. It was dirty and torn, but he could see that someone had stitched a name on the back in faded red. He crouched down and turned it over. The name was clear now. Arjun. He looked up at Mira, and her face crumpled. She reached for the backpack and hugged it to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks. Before Sundar could say anything, a sound drifted down the hallway. It was faint at first, a kind of muffled crying, but it grew louder as they moved closer to the end of the corridor. Arjun! Mira breathed, her voice breaking. But just as they reached the final door, Sundar froze. The sound wasn't quite right. It was a cry, yes, but it carried something else, a sharp edge of fear that sent chills down his spine. He glanced at Myra, who nodded, her hand clutching the backpack. Then he reached for the doorknob and slowly, carefully turned it. Inside the room, the darkness was thicker, but he could see shapes, the outlines of broken furniture, a flickering light bulb hanging by a wire, and in the corner, a small figure huddled under a pile of rags. Mira gasped and rushed forward, but Sundar caught her arm gently. Something didn't feel right. He took a step closer and then stopped. His breath caught in his throat. The small figure shifted, and a voice, thin and strained, whispered from the shadows, "Help me." But it wasn't just the child's voice. It was something else too, something he couldn't name yet, but made his hands go cold. Mira fell to her knees, sobbing, and reached toward the figure. Sundar stood perfectly still, staring at the little shoe sticking out from beneath the rags, his heart pounding. And then, from the darkness just beyond the boy, another voice spoke, low and hard. You shouldn't have come here. Asterisk, the choice's room was colder than Sundar expected, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. His eyes adjusted slowly to the faint light of the flickering bulb above, and what he saw made his stomach knot. The boy, Arjun, was crouched in the corner under a filthy pile of blankets and rags, his knees pulled tight to his chest, his tiny shoulders shaking. But it wasn't just the boy that made Sundar stop. It was the figures surrounding him. 3 boys, teenagers, stood over Arjun like shadows, blocking him from view. Their clothes hung loose, their faces hard and sharp from years of surviving these streets. One of them, taller than the others, with a jagged scar running from his eyebrow to his jaw, stepped forward when Sundar and Mira entered. You shouldn't have come here, the boy said, his voice low but full of warning. Mira ignored him. She dropped to her knees and reached out, her fingers trembling. Arjun, she whispered. Baby, it's me, I'm here now. The boy, in the corner, lifted his head slowly. His cheeks were streaked with dirt and tears, his lips chapped and cracked. When he saw Mira, something in his eyes softened for just a second, but then he looked at the teenagers and flinched. Shrinking back into the corner, Sundar felt a strange mix of fear and anger rising in his chest. He stepped closer, putting himself between the teenagers and Mira. His voice was steady, but quiet when he spoke. We're taking him, he said simply. The scarred boy smirked and shook his head. You think you can just walk in here and take what you want? Sundar took another step. He's a child. He doesn't belong here. Nobody belongs here. Another boy muttered from the side. His eyes darted nervously between Sundar and the door. Mira's hands reached the pile of rags at last, and she began tugging them away, but one of the boys kicked them back over Arjun and said, Don't touch him. Something in Sundar snapped then. He remembered his own childhood. The times older boys cornered him after school, took his lunch, pushed him to the ground because he was smaller, quieter, different. He remembered the way it felt to clench his fists in his pockets and pretend not to cry. He looked the scarred boy in the eye and said, Louder now. Move. For a moment, no one moved. The silence stretched, thick and tense. Then, slowly, the scarred boy grinned. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife, the blade catching the weak light as it opened with a click. Mira gasped, pulling Arjun closer to her, shielding him with her body. Sundar's pulse pounded in his ears, but he didn't back away. Instead, he held the boy's gaze and said evenly, Put it down. You don't want to do this. The boy took a step closer, the knife low at his side. Then something unexpected happened. His grin faltered. He looked at Sundar for a long moment, something unreadable flashing in his eyes, and then, without a word, he dropped the knife at Sundar's feet. It clattered against the tile, the sound louder than anything else in the room. The scarred boy stepped back and muttered, Take him, then. But you don't know what you're walking into. The other 2 boys exchanged uneasy glances and backed toward the door, melting into the shadows. The scarred boy lingered for a moment longer, staring at Sundar with a kind of bitter respect. Before he too disappeared, Sundar let out a slow breath and crouched down next to Mira and Arjun. She was clutching the boy tightly, whispering to him over and over, You're safe now. You're safe now. But Sundar's eyes were drawn too. The knife at his feet. It glinted in the weak light, a quiet reminder that this wasn't over, that whatever they had stumbled into was bigger and darker than he had imagined. Then, as Mira smoothed Arjun's hair and murmured his name, Sundar noticed something that made his chest tighten. Under the rags, just beyond Arjun's little shoe. Another shape was visible, small and motionless. Sundar froze, staring at it. It was another foot. And it wasn't moving. He looked up at Mira, his voice barely above. A whisper. Myra? Who else is here? Her eyes followed his gaze, and her face went pale dot slowly, carefully. Sundar reached out and pulled the rest of the rags aside. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Another child, younger, maybe 2 or 3, lay curled in the darkness, their tiny chest rising and falling so faintly he wasn't sure at first if they were alive. Their skin was cold, their lips blue, their eyes closed tight as though hiding from the world. Mira's hand flew to her mouth, and she let out a broken sob. Sundar stared at the little body, his hands trembling now. He felt the room closing in around him, the sound of his own heartbeat deafening. He didn't know who this second child was Dot, but he knew one thing: they didn't have much time. And as he looked back at the door where the teenagers had disappeared, he heard the faint echo of their parting words. You don't know what you're walking into. Asterisk the truth. Room felt colder now, as though the air itself had turned to glass and was ready to shatter. Sundar stayed crouched, staring at the small, motionless child lying beside Arjun, trying to convince himself that the faint rise and fall of their tiny chest was real. Mira's hands trembled as she reached forward, brushing a few damp strands of hair away from the child's forehead. Her fingers hovered for a second and settled gently on the child's cheek. They told me he was gone, she whispered, her voice so thin it almost disappeared into the silence. They told me I'd never see him again. The little boy, Arjun, clung tighter to her now, burying his face in her shoulder. But his eyes darted toward the younger child, full of fear and something else Sundar couldn't quite name. The faint blue tint of the smaller child's lips sent a chill through Sundar. Instinctively, he slipped out of his coat and wrapped it around the boy's tiny body, lifting him into his arms. The weight was nothing, far too light, and it reminded him of when he carried his own daughter to bed after she'd fallen asleep on the couch. He could feel how cold the boy's skin was, how weak his breaths had become. Mira wiped her face with the back of her sleeve and whispered, "That's him. That's my Arjun." At first, Sundar didn't understand. He looked down at the small child he held, then back at the older boy, still clinging to her. Confusion flickered in his chest. But then he saw it, the older boy's eyes darting away, his small hands curling into fists, in the way he quietly said, almost to himself, "They made me say it." Mira froze. What? The older boy, the nephew, Sundar realized, sniffled and stared at the floor. They told me if I didn't pretend to be him, if I didn't say I was Arjun, they'd hurt him. Worse. A strange heaviness settled in the pit of Sundar's stomach. Everything began to fit together, piece by piece. The quiet way the older boy had avoided her eyes earlier. The hesitation in his voice when she'd called him her son. The way the teenagers had smirked and called him hers as if it were some kind of cruel joke. Mira's lips parted, and she let out a sound between a sob and a gasp. Her fingers shook as she reached out for the boy in Sundar's arms. "My son," she breathed. "My real son." The little boy stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open, just enough to look at her. And in that fragile moment, Sundar felt something he hadn't felt in years, a kind of fierce protectiveness that burned in his chest and pushed everything else away. "We need to get him to a hospital," he said quickly. "Now." But as he stood, the faintest whisper escaped the small boy's lips, words so soft Sundar almost didn't catch them. "Don't. Let her take me back." Sundar froze mid-step, staring down at the boy. His heart skipped. Mira didn't hear him. She was still murmuring his name, her tears falling fast now. But Sundar couldn't ignore it. The boy's little hand clutched weakly at his sleeve, his eyes darting toward Mira with something close to terror before they slid shut again. For a moment, the world around Sundar seemed to blur. He could hear the echo of his own mother's voice, years ago, telling him that kindness was about more than helping. It was about understanding, about seeing what no one else wanted to see. He looked at Mira now, at her desperate eyes, her trembling hands and at the boy in his arms. And he felt a quiet unease settle into his bones. He didn't know the full story, but he knew this much. Something here was wrong. Very wrong. He tightened his grip on the boy and turned to Myra. We're taking him out of here, he said firmly. But we're going to do it my way. Myra hesitated, startled by the edge in his voice. But then she nodded, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. Sundar carried the boy out of the room, his own footsteps echoing loudly against the broken tiles. The weight of the child in his arms was heavier now, not in pounds, but in meaning. In questions he didn't yet know how to answer Dot as they stepped back into the alley. The night air wrapped around them like a shroud. His driver stood by the car, his eyes wide with worry, but Sundar didn't stop. He opened the door himself and slid into the back seat, cradling the boy carefully. Hospital, he told the driver sharply. As fast as you can. The car peeled away from the curb, leaving the dark alley and the broken doorway behind them. Myra sat across from him now, her hands clasped in her lap, her lips moving silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in regret. Sundar kept his eyes on the boy's face, watching for every faint breath, feeling the slight warmth of his small body through the fabric of his coat, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't forget the look in the boy's eyes when he whispered. Those words couldn't shake the fear in his voice. Don't. Let her take me back. He didn't know who to believe anymore, Dot, and as the car raced through the empty streets toward the hospital, he made himself a quiet promise to find the truth, to see this through. No matter what it cost him, Dot, just as he turned back to look at the boy again, the driver slowed suddenly. Flashing red and blue lights lit up the street ahead, and a pair of police cars blocked the road outside the hospital entrance. Myra gasped softly, her hands flying to her mouth. Sundar frowned, his jaw tightening. Two officers approached the car as they stopped. One of them tapped on the window, his expression hard. Sir, the officer said as Sundar rolled the glass down. Step out of the vehicle, please. We have some questions for you. Sundar froze, his arms still wrapped around the boy. The world outside seemed to grow sharper, colder, more dangerous in an instant. Asterisk. He could feel Mira's eyes on him, full of something he couldn't name, fear, hope, or perhaps a secret she still wasn't telling. Dot slowly. He looked from her to the boy, then back to the officer, and somewhere deep inside him, a quiet voice whispered, You don't know what you're walking into. Asterisk detests thee. Silence in the car felt louder than the sirens outside. Sundar sat perfectly still, his arms wrapped tightly around the boy, his back straight against the leather. See, through the open window he could hear the static crackle of police radios, the crunch of heavy boots on the pavement, the low murmur of officers speaking to one another. But none of it felt real. It was as if the night had split in two, the world before this moment and the one after. The officer at the window cleared his throat. Sir, he repeated more firmly now, please step out of the vehicle. We have some questions for you. Myra flinched in the corner of the seat, her hands twisting in her lap, her eyes darting between Sundar and the boy. Sundar could feel her fear pressing into the air around them. But he didn't move right away. Instead, he looked down at the boy in his arms, whose eyelids fluttered weakly, but did not open. The boy's earlier words whispered through his mind again. Don't let her take me back. Something inside Sundar hardened then. He shifted the boy slightly, careful not to wake him, and looked up at the officer. I'll step out, he said evenly. But first, I need you to call for a doctor. This boy needs help now. The officer hesitated, clearly not used to being given instructions. But there was something in Sundar's voice, calm but unyielding, that made him nod. He gestured to another officer who ran toward the hospital. Doors, shouting for medical staff. Only then did Sundar gently place the boy into Mira's arms and slide out of the car. The cold air bit at his face as two officers guided him to the side and began asking rapid questions. Where did you find the child? Why were you in that alley? Who is the woman to you? Did you know the boy wasn't hers? Each question felt like a hammer pounding at his composure. Sundar answered quietly, truthfully, but he could see the suspicion in their eyes. To them, he was just another man holding a child who didn't belong to him. They didn't care about his title or his name. They only cared about what he was doing in the wrong part of the city, at the wrong time, with the wrong people. Behind him, he could hear Myra crying softly, whispering to the boy. He turned slightly, catching her gaze, but something in her eyes now made his stomach twist, a flash of guilt, perhaps, or a secret still hiding behind her tears. When the paramedics finally arrived, they lifted the boy onto a stretcher and wheeled him inside. Sundar followed them with his eyes until the hospital doors swung shut behind him. Swallowing the boy into sterile white light, an officer put a firm hand on his shoulder. "You'll need to come with us for a statement," he said. Sundar nodded, quietly, but inside he felt a sharp crack of doubt. For the first time tonight, he wondered if kindness had been a mistake. He had followed his heart into this dark maze, thinking he was helping. But now the boy was gone, Myra was silent, and he was standing on a sidewalk under police lights. Being treated like a criminal, they walked him into the station, a cold, fluorescent-lit room that smelled faintly of coffee and metal. He sat at a long table while an officer scribbled notes, asking the same questions again. Sundar answered patiently, even as his hands began to ache from clenching and unclenching them in his lap. Just when he thought the questioning would never end, a soft knock came at the door. Another officer poked his head in and said, "Sir, the boy is awake. He's asking for him." Sundar's head snapped up. "For me?" He asked. The officer nodded. They led him into a quiet hospital room where the boy lay on a narrow bed, and four in his tiny arm, his cheeks still pale, but his eyes open now, wide, dark, and full of something much older than his years. Myra sat at the foot of the bed, her hands folded tightly, her shoulders stiff. She didn't look at Sundar when he entered. The boy's gaze found him instantly. His little fingers twitched as he reached toward him. Sundar walked to the bedside and knelt down. "Hey," he said gently. "You're safe now." The boy's lips trembled as he spoke. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "She's not my mom," he said. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Mira let out a choked sob behind him, but still said nothing. The boy gripped Sundar's sleeve now, his small hand shaking. "They made me call her mama. But she's with them, the bad men. He swallowed hard, his eyes brimming with tears. "She sold me. And when I couldn't walk anymore, they left me there," she said. "She'd come back for me if I was quiet." Sundar felt a coldness wash over him. He turned slowly to look at Myra, who was now hunched forward, her face buried in her hands. Everything inside him screamed at once. Anger, sadness, disbelief. But beneath it all, there was a quieter voice too, one that reminded him of something his father once told him. You cannot save someone by hating them. You can only save them by seeing them for what they are and choosing to do better. He stood and gently pried the boy's hand off his sleeve. Myra finally looked up then, her face streaked with tears. She whispered, "I had no choice. You don't understand. But before she could finish, the door opened behind them, and a man stepped in. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, his hair graying at the temples. His face was familiar, so familiar that Sundar's breath caught in his chest. Because he knew this man, not from tonight, not from this city, but from years ago, back when he was just a boy in Chennai, standing outside the gates of his school, waiting for his father to finish work. The man smiled faintly now, though there was no warmth in it. "Hello, Sundar," he said softly. "It's been a long time." Sundar stared at him, his mind reeling. How was he here? And why? He looked from the man to the boy, to Mira, and suddenly realized that everything he thought he understood about this night was wrong. Completely. Terribly wrong. Asterisk the promiseth. The room was suddenly quiet in a way that felt wrong. Too still, like the calm before a storm. Sundar stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the man who had just walked in. For a long moment, it was as if the world outside the hospital room didn't exist. All he could see was the faint, knowing smile on the man's face. All he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The man stepped closer, his shoes making a soft sound on the linoleum floor. "You've done well for yourself," he said, his tone smooth but edged with something sharp. "I watched you from afar, CEO, headlines, speeches about kindness and progress. Yet here you are, in a dirty hospital room with them." Sundar's jaw tightened. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low, each word deliberate. The man raised an eyebrow, his smile fading slightly. "That boy," he said, nodding toward the small figure on the bed, "and that woman, they're part of my business. And you just wandered into something much bigger than you. Understand." Behind him, Myra flinched as if struck. She turned her face away, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. Sundar saw her shoulders trembling but didn't look away from the man. "So, this is about your business," Sundar said. The word left a bitter taste in his mouth. Children, fear, hunger, using people until they break. "That's your business." The man's smile sharpened. "And what's yours? Pretending you can fix the world with your name and your money? Pretending your hands are clean?" Sundar said nothing, but his silence was not surrender. Instead, he turned back to the boy who was watching them both now, his small face pale and scared, but also full of something unexpected. Trust. Sundar knelt by the bed, gently taking the boy's hand. "You're safe now," he said softly. "I promise." But the man behind him laughed, low and humorless. "Safe?" he said. "You can't keep him safe. Not from people like me. Not from the streets. This world eats children like him alive." Sundar looked up at him then, and for the first time all night, he smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, but it carried the weight of every moment of doubt and struggle he had ever endured. "Then I'll change the world," he said simply. "For him, for her, for all of them." The man's expression faltered, and for a flicker of a second, Sundar thought he saw fear in his eyes. But then the man straightened his coat, gave Mira one last cold look, and turned to leave. His footsteps faded down the hall until the room was quiet again. Mira sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Sundar sat beside the boy, still holding his hand, feeling the small pulse of life there. And in that moment, he thought of his mother again, the way she used to tell him that the measure of a man was not in what he owned, but in what he gave. Later that night, after the boy was resting and Mira had finally told the police everything, how she had been forced, how she had tried to save the boy, but was trapped in debts she could not repay, Sundar stood alone outside the hospital, staring at the city lights. They seemed to shimmer through the thin fog, distant and indifferent, but he didn't feel small anymore. He felt steady. He thought about the boy calling him father earlier, just before falling asleep. It hadn't been a mistake. The boy had said it with a kind of quiet certainty, as if he already knew what Sundar hadn't yet admitted. That family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one you choose. Asterisk.